Hello friends, welcome to my sewing tutorial for the Megan top. This is a halter neck top which is suitable for woven fabrics, and it has a square neckline, and as you can see it has quite a steep low drop under the arms. It's fully lined and it's got a relaxed fit as well. I would say this project's good if you're a confident beginner at sewing and above, and I'll have the link to download the pattern in the description box below. The pattern also comes with fully illustrated and written instructions, and I'm going to write all the timestamps for all the steps in the description box in case you want to skip ahead to a particular step. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy the video and feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions, and let's get started. So for the demonstration, I'm using this blue fabric as the main fabric, and I've got the front, the back, and two straps cut out of my main fabric, and then I've cut only the front and back out of this beige lining fabric. When you open the pattern download, there's different folders depending on the paper size you're using and also the instructions. So you can choose your paper size, and then you can either only print this main file, and I'll show you in the video how to cut the pieces down to make the lining, or you can print both the main and the lining. It's up to you whether you want to print and tape together both or just only print out one. To begin, I'll just talk through the notches on the pieces. So on the front there's two circles, and those are for the darts, and I normally just use an awl to poke a hole through the fabric, just a small hole, or you can use some chalk or a pin in place to keep track of where that is. And then on the side seams of the front there's two notches for the dart legs, and usually with my scissors I just cut in just a very small snip, like under 5mm. You don't want to do it too big because then you'll start cutting into the piece of clothing. But for the sake of the video, I'm just going to draw on with chalk as well so you can see them clearly. And then on the back, there's a single notch on the side seam, and that just helps us when we're sewing to match up the front and back. And then along the top of the back and front, there are these two sets of double notches, and they show us where the straps go. The notches aren't actually very important for the lining pieces. I just drew them in because they were there, but you don't actually need to mark them on the lining. So I've just gone through and made sure all my notches are marked in correctly before I begin. The other thing with this top being lined is it is really important to keep track of the right and wrong side of the fabric. So with some fabrics it's super obvious, like if it's a print there's usually a more vibrant side and then there's a faded side. Because I'm using this solid where it's not obvious at all, the sides of the fabric actually both look the same, what I'll do is I'll just pick one side. I try to be consistent and just assign that to be my wrong side, and I usually mark each piece with chalk. For the video I'm going to use this colored tape, and that way when I'm sewing I know that, okay, the side with the tape means I'm on the wrong side of the fabric, and the side without the tape means I'm working on the right side of the fabric. Now I'll go through and trim my lining. So I cut mine out the same size. You don't need to do this if you printed out the lining file and cut it out separately. But I'm just using some chalk and a ruler and marking 2.5 centimeters off the hem, and also marking 3mm off the armholes, and I'm doing that on both the front and back lining pieces. Once I've finished drawing those measurements in, I'm just trimming them away with my scissors, and you should end up with your lining pieces matching up like this. So you've got that little slither of 3mm shorter through the armholes, and then the 2.5 centimeters from the hem. Now it's time to sew the darts on the front main and front lining. So I'm working with the wrong side up, and I'm going to match these two dart legs together and fold it with the drill hole in the middle of the fold like so. So keeping those notches matching. And I'm going to use a ruler and chalk and just draw a straight line from the dart legs, and I'm going to go 1 centimeter past the drill hole. And I'm going to start my sewing where the notches are and just do a little back tack and then sew in a straight line along the chalk line that I just drew. When I get to right where the drill hole is, I'm just going to stop and I'm going to turn my stitch length down to like the second lowest, number 2. And then I'm just going to sew really slowly and go 1 stitch off the end of the dart and then pull my piece out, leaving a long trail of thread, and just tie a few knots to secure the thread and then trim that all away. Can you see how for that last sort of centimeter of sewing, I've tried to curve the sewing against the folded edge rather than coming in at a straight angle, and that's just going to help prevent the pointy nip look at the end of the dart. Now I'm just pressing all 4 of my darts and pressing them down towards the hem. For the straps, I've got my strap fabric wrong side up, and it's pretty straightforward. I'm just going to fold it in half and iron it in half first to get the center guideline, and then opening that back up, and I'm going to iron it folded again, meeting the middle guideline. I'm just folding this in half one last time to press it again, and for this part I usually do the fold, it's sort of like 1 millimeter away from the actual edge, and I think that just looks nicer than if the fold's right on the edge. You'll see later when I attach them that I kind of put this side as the wrong side, so you can't see any fold on the edge of the straps. And I'm just turning my stitch length back to my normal length, which is like 3, and then I'm just going to sew the strap closed, so no need to back tack at the beginning or end, it's just straight sewing down the folded edge for both straps. I'll give them a quick press before cutting them just to make sure they're nice and flat, and then I'm going to cut them to 20 centimeters, and that includes the seam allowance. To attach the straps, I've got the front and back main pieces facing right side up on my table, and then I'm going to pin the straps on the front here, and you can see I've got them going down towards the hem, not up. So they're going down towards the hem. I've got the edge stitching facing out towards the side seam, and the nicer side of my strap, so the side without the fold, is facing down towards the right side of the top. And then I'm going to flip this back piece so that my front and back are right sides together, and then pin it the same. So you can see how it looks here before I sew, and then I'm going to just stitch those down in place with a quick 6mm stitch to hold them in place. So as you can see, I'm just doing like little back tacks 6mm away from the edge to hold the straps in place before we attach the lining. To attach the lining at the neckline, if you've never sewn something like this before, I recommend just put your pieces exactly how I've got it on the table. So my front and back are right sides together, and then I've kind of flipped this back neckline out so the right side's up on my table. And then what we're going to do is match the right side of my lining at the neckline for both the front and the back, and then we're going to sew a 1 centimeter seam. And the straps are sandwiched in between and facing down. So the straps should not be coming out. They should be facing down towards the body of the top. And because we cut the lining slightly smaller than the main, see how there's that extra fabric on the main, the blue fabric? We need to ease that onto the lining. So I'm going to be sewing with the main on top, and I'll start with a 1 centimeter seam and do a back tack as per usual. And then what I'll do is I'll grab the other end and make sure that's flush. So I'm holding that firmly with my fingers on the other end to make sure they're going to meet. And then I'm using sort of like downward and forward pressure with my fingers to force the main to fit onto the lining. But I'm making sure I don't sew in any pleats or folds. I'm just kind of, it doesn't feel like it should work, but it just works. You're just making the blue fabric fit onto the lining fabric. And then once we get to the other end, it should still match flush, and finish that seam off with a back tack. You can see how after it's sewn there's this waviness in the main fabric, and that's the excess fabric, but there's no folds or pleats stitched in. And you can see this again with the back. So start with my back tack, make the other edge match and hold that in place, and then I'm kind of just using downward and forward pressure, like pushing that blue fabric forward as I sew to manipulate it and be the same size as the lining. You could also pin it in place first or do a gathering stitch first if you want, but there's not that much extra ease, so you should be able to just make it work as you sew. And I finished that off with a back tack, and here you can see that waviness again, how the main fabric, there's a little bit more through the seam allowance. And I'm going to overlock the neckline seam allowances. So I'm doing this with the main on top and just tidying up the cut edge with my overlocker for the front and back. For the neckline understitching, my main and straps are on the left, my seam allowance is pushed underneath towards the lining, and then my lining's on the right side of the needle. And then I'm lining up the foot of my sewing machine right on the fold, so my needle's just sewing along the edge like a millimeter away from the fold, and there's no need to back tack at the beginning or end. And I'm just running along there and then catching that seam allowance underneath. That's what it looks like once it's done, so the straps aren't caught in the sewing at all. Just repeating that on the other side, and you can see I'm kind of gently separating the main and lining. I'm not stretching it, but just separating them. So this is where I'm at with the top right sides out, so you can see the wrong sides are together on the inside. And I'm gonna press the necklines in place, and you can see how I've got the main fabric, it's just rolling slightly towards the lining. To sew the armholes, it's gonna be right sides together, so I'm gonna flip this front piece around, and I'm working one armhole at a time when I'm doing this. And then I'm matching up the curve so it's right sides together and the rest of the top's kind of inside. And then I'm gonna roll the seam allowance before I sew down towards the lining. So here you can see I'm rolling the seam allowance towards the lining, and I want to start my stitching with the needle right up against the edge of where I can feel the strap is underneath. So I'm not sewing through the strap, but right next to it. If it's not perfectly 1 centimeter, that's fine. It's better to be right next to it. And I do a back tack, and I'm just repositioning the pieces and making sure that the straps or the top inside isn't going to get caught in my stitching. And then I'm sewing a 1 centimeter seam allowance along the curve. And when I'm sewing a curve like this, I make sure that I'm not stretching out the curve, because then you're going to end up with really loose armholes. So I'm rotating as I go, and then do a back tack at the end. And I'll just check once I flip the strap right side out how it's looking. So you can see how, because I put the needle right next to the strap, I've got a straight line going from my strap to the side of the top, the armhole. Whereas if you have the needle too far away, you'll end up with a little like square sticking out, and you can go back and just sew a little bit closer if you need to. And this is where I'm at now once I've sewn all 4 armholes. So I'm going to check all my straps look good. I haven't got any strap caught up somewhere it shouldn't be, and just make sure it's all looking normal before I move on to the overlocking. And there's a couple of other things you can do. One is you may want to clip the curved armholes. You could make a judgment call that just helps them sit more flat. I'm not a huge clipper. I know some people like to clip the whole way through, but I usually just do a couple or none at all and just gauge it based on my fabric. But here you can see once I've clipped that, it just sits a bit more flat around the curve. And then you can also clip away some of the bulk where the strap is meeting the top at the corner there. And again, I like to just cut away like a half of the bulk. Some people will cut the whole thing. It's personal preference, but I like to keep a little bit to kind of reinforce that corner and keep it sturdy. So you can see once I flip it out, there's a little bit of that extra bulk has been removed. The next step is to overlock the armholes. So I'm working one armhole at a time, just pulling one of them out to the outside and just overlocking along the seam allowance to tidy it up. I'm overlocking with the mains on top, and as you can see, when I go over those clipped curves, I'm just slightly opening up the clipping so that there's a little bit of room for the clip to be open, and then trailing off the end up by the neckline. And for this overlocking up by the neckline, I'm gonna trim off the excess and then tie off by pulling on a couple of the looper threads just to secure it. Now it's time to do the understitching on the armholes. So I'm pulling out my top, right side's out, and it's starting to look like a top now. So I'll have the main on the left again, the lining on the right, and I'm going to be sewing on the lining with the seam allowance underneath getting caught, and we won't be able to get all the way to the top, so I'm going to stop sewing around here and back tack at the end. So as you can see, I'm just making sure my seam allowance is getting caught underneath, and I'm using my fingers to feel that I'm stitching with the seam allowance underneath. And you have to kind of bunch up the top as you sew, and then just make sure you're not sewing through more layers than what you're meant to. And again, with sewing a curve, I'm just rotating as I go, and I'm gently pulling the main and the lining apart. And I'm just going to keep sewing until it's going to start to feel wrong, like it's going to start to feel like you can't go any further, and then I'll do a back tack. This is what it looks like once it's finished, the understitching there. I finished all 4 of the armhole understitching, and I've got these, they're like blunt tweezers that I use, and I'm just going to gently push out the corners by all my straps. Now I'm ironing the armholes, and it's good to do this really thoroughly because once you continue sewing, you can't really press it the same again. And you can see how, because the lining was smaller, we have that beautiful roll from the edge where the folded edge isn't right on the edge. It has this really nice crisp line, so from the front you can't see the seam. I'm gonna lay my top out flat first to make sure I don't tangle anything up. And then to match the side seams right sides together, I'm going to grab these two, the hems of the main right sides together, and then match the hems of the lining right sides together. So we're going to be sewing in this one long line, a 1 centimeter seam. So I'll start my sewing at the hem all the way to the other hem and keeping the middle meeting. So that's the underarm point that we want to match. Here I am, so I'm starting with a back tack. This is at the hem and I've got the fronts on top, by the way. So doing a back tack, and then it's just a straight 1 centimeter seam, and I keep the dart bulk flush against the edge as I sew over that. And then I'm just checking that my underarm point, that's matching, and use my fingers to keep it matching. But if you're a beginner, you can definitely put a pin or baste that with a needle and thread just to make sure you're going to keep it matching. And then I'm just repositioning the lining to make sure that matches at the hem also. And then I'm just using my fingers to sew in a straight line and keep all the fabric together as I get to the other side, and making sure I don't catch anything that I'm not supposed to be. Once I finish both side seams, this is what it looks like. So it's one long 1 centimeter seam allowance, and I'm going to just clip away a little bit of this extra bulk here before I go and overlock the seam allowance. And this is exactly the same as where I went before. So with the front on top, I'm just tidying up the seam allowance and going over that dart bulk as well. Now I'm pressing the side seams towards the backs of the top, and then I'll put the lining inside the main, right sides out, so you can see it's nearly finished. Yay, very exciting. I'm going to overlock the hem next, starting at a side seam and just go in one big circle, and same for the lining. So right side on top, starting at one of the sides, either side. I try to keep it the same for the main and lining just to be consistent, but just tidying the edge with the overlocker and getting rid of all the little frays. And when I get back to the beginning, I'm just gonna overlap it a little bit, maybe like 2 centimeters, and then trail off. And then I'll trim and tie those edges off to secure it. The hem is 1 centimeter, so I'm going to iron up the hem 1 centimeter towards the wrong side on both the main and the lining, ironing all the way around, and sew the hem in one big circle like we did before with the overlocking, starting at a side seam and going all the way around in one big circle. I've got the inside edge of my foot right against the cut edge of the fabric, so I'm sort of like edge stitching the needle right in the middle of the overlocking, and then I put my magnet to make sure I stay the same distance around the whole thing. That's why you want to make sure your ironing's nice and even at 1 centimeter. And then I'm just going to zoom around the whole thing, and I don't start with a back tack, but once I get back to the beginning here, I go a bit slowly and sew exactly on top of where I started, and then I back tack over that, and that's to secure it closed. And here I'm doing exactly the same on the lining, so I'm going around in one big circle, no back tack in the beginning, but then I back tack over the beginning stitches. Now for the final little stitch in the ditch by the underarms. This is just doing a little back tack right in the fold in the ditch of the side seam at the top, and that's going to stop the lining from flipping out to the front. Now it's time for the final iron, big press. Make sure it's all looking Very beautiful. And voila, here is the finished Megan top. This is one that I made out of white linen with a cotton lining. And I'll have the link to the pattern in the description box below if you want to check it out. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and you learned something new today. Bye!